before, but not as a speaker, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to welcome you tonight to present Deathbed Scenes as Death of Community in Mid-20th Century Irish-American Fiction. I would just like to give you a little bit of information about Dr. Anish. She was educated at Fitchburg State College and at URI is where you got your PhD. And she has written a dissertation on writing Irish America, cultural memory and the narrative of nation in diaspora. Dr. Anish presents courses at the Community College, Rhode Island on contemporary Irish and Irish American literature of American immigrant experience. And if you'd like to maybe elaborate a little more
Sure.
on some of that, because I'm just going through a potted biography on the website. So we've got a interested audience here tonight, so let's get ahead with the program. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and welcome Dr. Anish.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I finished my PhD at URI a year ago now, and the topic of my research was Irish American identity, basically, as seen through the literature of Irish America. And those courses that Margaret listed, those are my areas of academic interest, really. I teach intro to literature and the short story and composition at CCRI. So, and thank you to all of you for being here, including a couple of my CCRI colleagues who made short and long journeys to get here. So this presentation reflects a small portion of the work that I did on my dissertation. It's from chapter 1, mostly. But it's also going to be in a collection of essays about deathbed scenes in Irish and Irish American literature. So this comes from a chapter of a book that should come out a year or so from now, as far as I know. Over the next year, I hope to turn the whole dissertation into a book myself, and that I've taken a sabbatical semester in the fall to be able to do that. But this also comes out of a lifelong fascination with my Irish heritage, and I started studying it academically probably as a senior in high school. I started writing about it first, and then through my undergraduate years at Boston College, as well as later on into my graduate work whenever I could. I was studying Irish literature or Irish history. So this is a long time coming. And one of the books that actually sparked my interest in this topic is called All Souls. It's a memoir by Michael Patrick MacDonald. And it's a memoir of growing up in South Boston, in the tropics, basically. And in that memoir, he talks about a lot of things. But one of them is the St. Patrick's Day parade that runs through his neighborhood. And some of the images would make St. Patrick blush, probably, that he talks about. So I started to wonder why such things as plastic shamrocks and drunkenness on St. Patrick's Day parade day, why those things have come to mean Irishness or Irish culture in America. So that's where I got started. And from there I did lots of reading and research in Irish history, and especially Irish American literature, but some contemporary Irish literature as well. So it's a fitting week to talk about this with St. Patrick's Day coming up on Saturday. And that's not a main part of my talk, but will be, I'll try to tie it in at the end. Okay. So I'd first like to give a little bit of historical background on the Irish in America during this time period about which I'll be talking, which is really the first half of the 20th century. Then I'll get into 3 novels that I want to discuss today, which were all written between 1946 and 1956. And all of those novels in their own way examine what happened to the Irish community in this country, or especially in the cities really of the Northeast, over those decades, the first part of the 20th century. I argue that all 3 of these novels signal a shift that's happening in the Irish American community at that time. And Before we get to those novels, though, we need to look at how we got to that point. So, just a few statistics, and all of these come from, it's a very small citation at the bottom, Kevin Kenny's book, The American Irish, A History. And I have a reading list put together for you that you can take with you if you want further suggestions on reading about Irish in America. This is one of the good histories that I've used. But just some of the statistics. Most people know about the famine. If they know anything about Irish history, they know about the famine. And that not only did 1 million people die of starvation and associated diseases during that time, but a couple million more left Ireland, and 1.5 million of those in that famine decade, as Kenny calls it, came to the United States. But the immigration to the United States didn't start there and it didn't end there. It was happening before the famine and then continued as poverty and poor conditions continued in Ireland. As you see there, between 1856 and 1921, more than 3 million more Irish settled in the US. So by 1900, the Irish-born population in the US was over 1.6 million, and the second generation, meaning those who had at least one Irish-born parent, was nearly 3.4 million. So Kenny says that's the peak of the second generation Irish population. And this is a quote from Kenny here: these 5 million first and second generation Irish Americans in 1900 exceeded the entire population of Ireland by more than 500,000 at that time. So more Irish here than there in 1900. Anyway, the sheer numbers of Irish coming into the country at that time, and again, especially into the cities of the Northeast, is really what I'm talking about today, along with a preference for communal living, prompted the Irish to settle together in what became concentrated ethnic neighborhoods, and really America's first concentrated ethnic neighborhoods of those who came by choice into the cities of the Northeast: Boston, Providence, New York City, even going west toward Chicago as well. At the center of these neighborhoods, as soon as they could gather funds, and they worked hard to gather these funds, was the Catholic Church in pretty much any case that I've read about. And there were Protestant Irish here as well as Catholic Irish, but these northeastern cities, these particular populations I'm looking at, were mostly Catholic, mostly centered around a Catholic parish. Historian J.J. Lee describes the parish as, quote, a bonding unit for Irish Catholics with the church, often the most impressive construction they could consider their own, built from their own dollars and cents, the psychological and the physical focal point of their communal identity. In congregating so closely together, the Irish in America were replicating what's called, there's an Irish word called clahan, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, pretty close anyway. And a clahan is what David Lloyd, he describes it as close living quarters that promoted sharing of culture. This was a system of farming. Close sharing of culture, stories, song, and dance. Before the famine, according to theorist David Lloyd, the Irish land was organized this way. Small cottages abutted one another, and pastures for grazing were shared. There was no need to mark ownership of property. Repairs on buildings were done together, and the purpose of work was just to have enough to be fed, clothed, and sheltered. So there was a lack of need to accumulate capital. It wasn't what the system was meant for. And to the British capitalists, when they came in and saw this, it looked very disorganized and not, maybe not like a system at all. Author Peter Quinn finds that in America the Irish crowded into urban ghettos because, quote, crowding was part of who they were. So he says that this, the tenements of the urban settlements I'm talking about were the American version of this clan system. He describes the Claham as a clump of cabins that leaned on one another, a physical embodiment of the tight-knit community built on a communal method of land distribution, and says that outsiders often remarked on the intense conviviality of the Claham, the incessant emphasis on singing, dancing, and storytelling that wasn't merely part of Irish culture, but its living heart, the vessel of its survival. And he talked about that being the way that education happened in Irish communities. It was through stories and through song and through this way of living. With the famine and the emigration and the resultant consolidation of farms into bigger farms, not often owned by Irish, this way of life was fading away. But again, replicated here in the States and in other places in Ireland, other urban places in Ireland as well. Historian Tim Maher, who actually he's got a nationally acclaimed history called Inventing Irish America, if I get that title right. Inventing Irish America, yeah. And his test case, the community that he studies is Worcester, Massachusetts. And so he's renowned throughout Irish studies for studying what, for many of us, is our parents' place that they grew up and the community in which they grew up. And he talks about how Irish in America valued, when they first got here, valued communalism over individualism. And he called this a mixed blessing. He said for 19th century Irish immigrants that he studied in Worcester, communalism was not very helpful in a society that favored individual ambition and risk-taking. But it softened the blows of a harsh urban industrial world, offering family or community strategies for survival, even as it helped retard individual mobility. So this was the type of neighborhood, the type of environment that the Irish first moved into, that they established mid-19th century, late 19th century, and into the turn of the 20th century. As the Irish American literature surveyed in this project shows, however, there was a social and psychic cost to pay for those who chose to change that, to put the individual before the communal, especially as this 20th century changes are happening. So we've got a shift, as I said, and things start to change. Beginning in the 1920s, although there's still a good number of Irish that came in the 1920s, the immigration legislation that was enacted at that time restricted immigration by nationality and by quotas within nationality. That combined with two world wars on either side of this, the Great Depression and all of those factors, slowed down Irish immigration to a trickle compared to what it had been in the decades leading up to that. So this little bullet here, I think, tells the story pretty well. In the 1920s, 220,000 plus Irish came to the US. But in the 1930s, that went down to 13,000. In the 1940s, it bounced back a little bit to not much, to 26,000, still well below what it had been in those several decades from the famine into the 1920s. And then the other big change at this time, about the time that these books that I want to talk about were being written, is the GI Bill for returning soldiers, which offered more economic opportunities through education and through, I believe, housing loans as well, than had previously been available to most Irish Americans. So this meant that people started moving out of those ethnic neighborhoods. They say it happens slowly in Boston, for example, that people still preferred the urban, but eventually it did. And I'd say that these authors that I'm talking about could see this change happening in the middle of the 20th century. So here's the three novels, and these are really the heart of my talk. I'm not a historian, I'm a literary scholar, if that's what you want to call me. And so I'm just, all those facts and figures come from other published histories, which I'll share with you at the end. But these are the books that really spoke to me, and I just couldn't help seeing this trend of concern, anxiety even, over a loss of communal identity, of a loss of Irish identity in the US. So we've got 3 books here, as you can see. Our Own Kind by Edward McSorley from 1946. And this is a great little regional novel set in Providence. Those of you who know Providence well might even know the streets, and he maps this out very clearly. This is a Providence novel through and through, and it's a Providence Irish novel. The Parish in the Hill does the same thing for Holyoke, Mass. Published just a couple years later by Mary Doyle Curran. And then the last, and the most famous probably, The Last Hurrah by Edwin O'Connor, which was published in 1956. And that one never names Boston, but it's Boston being discussed there. So a little bit about these novels all together, and then I'll talk about them individually. The fiction and memoirs of Irish Americans can tell us about their experience in this country, specifically about the conflicts that come from trying to maintain an ethnic identity in the face of sometimes a hostile majority population. Historical fiction is not history, but it can offer us some insights into the lives of people not otherwise captured in history books. These are the little people, not fairies or leprechauns, but the people behind the scenes of history, such as mill and factory workers, housewives, small business owners, people who have been leaders maybe in their own neighborhoods in these novels, but whose fame would not reach beyond them. They wouldn't be published in books any other way but through the imagination of these authors who make them up. So each of the novels I'm going to discuss for the remainder of this talk is written in the middle of the 20th century, but it harkens back a little bit earlier, usually to the late 1800s or early 1900s. The communities of the author's grandparents, really. So McSorley grew up in Providence, and you can tell, again, through and through, it's all Providence. Doyle Curran grew up in Holyoke, and writes about her community there, though she fictionalizes it, and she makes up this grandfather figure I'm going to talk about. And then O'Connor did not grow up in Boston. He's actually from Rhode Island as well, from Woonsocket, I believe. But he adopted Boston as home, working as a journalist there a little bit later. So all of these novels, I'd say, they're critiquing this generation that's coming up at the time that they're being written. These folks who are coming of age, maybe 1930s, 1940s, say. But keep in mind that we're so often critical of a new generation and its ways, and so often we do talk about the old generation as the good old days, you know. And that is happening a bit here, right? So there's certainly some of that, but there's also a useful remembrance of what it was like to be Irish in America in the early 20th century. And it gets at, again, the lives of these people the way that a history book does not. So we just have to kind of be on the lookout for things that are overly idealized, I guess. Let's see. All of these books suggest that in forgetting the stories and values of these people from the earlier 20th century, late 19th century, if we forget those values, that we risk losing something valuable. Irish America risks losing its soul, even, especially in The Parish in the Hill. That is brought about quite vividly. With some exceptions, the new generation coming up is painted as bullying, as cold and calculating, as out for this individual rather than communal success. They lack the warmth, humor, generosity, and spirituality of their immigrant forebears. They have religion, but it's more for outward show, for respectability, and has become tinged with kind of a Puritan emphasis on sin. The authors would, I would say, argue that the Catholicism that the immigrants brought over was more, much more spiritual, much less rigid, and that's all true. at least a couple of the books. Less so in the last while. It doesn't get into Catholicism as much. The new generation's also embarrassed by their roots, they're embarrassed by their humble beginnings. And in each of these novels, an elder of the community, and in the first two novels, an immigrant, and in the last, the son of immigrants, dies after trying to impart through stories and moral lessons the ways of Irish American community as it once was to either a grandchild in the first two novels or a nephew in the last. Each of these characters is a skilled storyteller, a trait that over and over in the literature is aligned with Irishness. No surprise there. So I am going to read a little from the chapter that I've written on this, just because I summarized the books there and then talk about the deathbed scenes, which was the point of this, right? So, set in Providence, Rhode Island in the years around 1916, Edward McSorley's Our Own Kind tells the story of Ned McDermott's education of his orphaned grandson Willie, a feat complicated by Ned's own illiteracy. Ned is an immigrant, and his position in the iron foundry is a molder, spelled M-O-U-L-D-E-R. But this is a position that McSorley uses as a literary device. Ned's chief desire is to mold his grandson into a man who will command respect for his knowledge, but also be compassionate to those who may not have risen as high. His dream is to make of Willie a respected, educated man, one whom even the hated Yankees, not the baseball team, still as hated though, in that case, who dominate the New England economic and political structure would have to admire. He does not want Willie to forget from whence he came, from humble beginnings and 2 generations back from Ireland. Willie experiences moments when he falls off the path that his grandfather lays out for him, such as when he takes part in hitting an elderly Jewish man walking through town with friends, and when he steals cigarettes from a neighborhood store, both with the same group of troublemaking friends. In the first case, Ned must remind Willie of the prejudiced Irish Catholics faced when they first came to this country, recalling vicious rumors about priests and nuns, the burning of a convent in Boston, and the near burning of one, which Ned and others stood outside to defend, in Providence. He asked Willie, "What is it? Our turn now to be savages? God damn it, Willie, is that what is to come of all the schools and the teaching?" And tells him, quote, "Thick as we are, we're above that, I hope, above raising a hand against a man because his faith is not our faith." Ned does not discipline Willie for stealing the cigarettes because that's already been handled in a beating administered by Ned's cousin, Lieutenant Larry McDermott of the Providence Police. Larry is shown to be the defender of the rising business community and by extension of capitalism, even against his own family members and the rest of the Irish working class. When Ned's other son, Pat, dies from injuries sustained at a socialist rally to advance workers' rights, it's suspected that Larry was involved in that beating as well. On his deathbed, Ned uses his iron casting as a metaphor for the work he had left to do in molding Willie. Ned's most telling dying words are not to a priest with whom he can only get across some incoherent mumbles, but hours earlier to his best friend Tim. He says, well, what is most on Ned's mind as he dies is the future he had envisioned for Willie. Ned tells Tim, quote, "God help me, the job is only half done, only started. It's only the pattern is put in the flask and the sand pounded around it, the iron's not poured into it. I'm standing with the empty ladle in my hands, the job only half done." Ned is only partway to molding Willie into a gentleman scholar when he dies. He's distraught that he will not be around to finish the job. Ned's plans for Willie's future are in doubt when Willie's jealous uncle Chris, the man of the house after Ned's passing, suggests that Willie must find a job to help with the finances instead of continuing his education. Willie is about 14 at this time. Once Ned is gone, all his careful plans are gone with him. The immigrant generation cannot stay to guide young Irish Americans through the molding process that would make them successful Americans. With someone like Ned as a guide, McSorley McSorley suggests, an Irish American could gain an education without losing sight of the way he should treat others, with compassion and generosity, no matter their religion or social status. Willie realizes the stranger Ned's plans for his future would have made of him, however. Wise as Ned is, even he does not see that the potential end result of his hopes, that as the potential end result of his hopes and dreams. Only Willie suspects that in being educated up and out of his community, he'll no longer recognize himself. McSorley, writing 30 years into the Irish-American future, sees the strangers who've been made of the very opportunities their immigrant grandparents dreamed for them. Without the grandparents there to finish the job, newer generations are pulled more toward capitalist, individualist American values and away from the communal values with which the Irish had arrived. In closing the novel, McSorley makes it clear that it's not just Ned dying, but a whole generation. After Ned's death, Willie ponders how long the family will leave Ned's hat on the nail where it's always hung on the kitchen door when he came in. Willie recognizes that the immigrant generation is dying out. He says, quote, "The hat may be there a long time, as long as his grandmother and Nora, his aunt, were there. But that itself might not be so long either. Soon, Willie thought, all these old people would be laying out there under the willows at St. Anne's, where his grandfather lay. Leaving behind what? A little shell of a house someone would snatch from those dear to them? Probably an old hat, a pair of silver rosary beads, and the memory of a few bright words in the hearts of those they left behind." Let's see. When McSorley is writing, Ned's generation is already in the past. The author knows how few of their words and values have survived because he is living in a time beyond them, when the Chris McDermotts, Willie's uncle, and the Larry McDermotts, the police officer, social climbers and bullies, have become the face of the Irish-American community. So next up is Mary Doyle Curran's The Parish and the Hill. And this book is a book about communal memory, set in Curran's hometown of Holyoke, Mass. During the 1920s and through the start of the Great Depression. Each of these books, I should say, the time period aligns with the childhood of the author. So McSorley was born, I want to say, in 1908, and most of the events of that novel start around 1916. They reference the Easter Rising, which is the only real firm date in there. So McSorley, were he remembering his own childhood, would have been a boy about the same age as Willie. And here you have kind of a similar thing where Mary Doyle Curran, this novel set in the 1920s, the author was born about 1917, and it starts in her preschool years. So again, she's remembering the time period where she grew up, in the place she grew up, if fictionalizing some of the actual people and events. So this one goes 1920s and through the start of the Great Depression, at least. The central conflict in Doyle Curran's novel is the battle between retaining one's Irish self and losing it as one tries to move up in in American society. Chapter 1 introduces the novel's two opposing settings, Irish Parish and Money Mole Hill. These two settings have personalities as if they were human characters, with Irish Parish the home of the shanty Irish from Kerry, acting as humble immigrant protagonist, and the Hill as the stuck-up native antagonist, the residents of the snobbish lace-curtain Irish and the Yankees, again, they so desire to be like, though they hate them. Narrator Mary O'Connor's family has moved to the Hill at the insistence of her father, who looks up to the Yankee members of his community as models of respectability. Mary explains, quote, "I grew up on the Hill with my grandfather and then my mother protecting me as well as they could against the misery and shame of being shanty Irish on Money Mole Hill. All of us, for the first time, were introduced to an insecurity and isolation that has not lessened during the years." So while they were in Irish Parish, and this is the sense that you get about all of these concentrated ethnic communities, they feel secure because they're still with their own kind, as McSorley's novel indicates, right? And they don't have to feel inferior because they're all the same. where they are there. But when they move up the hill, that feeling of security goes away. So this move from Irish parish is shown to be more traumatic for these characters than the original move from Ireland even, because this move is what finally breaks the sense of Irish community they had managed to retain when concentrated in the parish, sharing the same culture they had shared in Ireland. Mary O'Connor is the voice of the third generation Irish American pulled between her grandfather's Irish traditions and her father's and brother's desires to be American. I remember when I was born, she says to start chapter 2, but it's not her literal birth she remembers here. It's her birth into consciousness of the community she shares with her grandfather, Johnny O'Sullivan. He's her earliest memory. He's also her only living tie to Ireland. As an immigrant from County Kerry, Johnny is acknowledged as the greatest storyteller in Irish parish. Johnny's apartment in Irish parish, like Ned's, McDermott's in Providence, is the gathering place of the neighbors. They come to sit by the fire and hear stories after long days of work. Johnny is also a leader and someone the other immigrants turn to for political advice. When others express a fear about foreigners, in this case the newer Polish immigrants, you can listen for our contemporary politics coming through all of this, by the way, coming to take Irish American jobs because they're willing to work for less, Johnny responds, drawing parallels to English colonialism in Ireland, "It will do no good to be fighting with them. It's what the Yankees may be looking for. They're great dividers of the opposition, as you well know, setting one half of a country against another. You've all seen the waste in that." As is Ned McDermott, Johnny is keen on keeping workers united, no matter what their ethnicity, against the bosses who would abuse them. Johnny sees the Irish as equally foreign and therefore natural allies with other immigrants. If they all want the rights that they deserve, they should work together, he thinks. Johnny understands and fears the way Irish Americans are headed if they rise up by stepping on other people's backs. Also, like Ned McDermott, Johnny O'Sullivan has a profound influence on his grandchild, showing her how to treat others with compassion. One day at the park, he gently nudges Mary into sharing her candy with poor Polish immigrant children after she's been showing off in front of them other weeks. And Mary says of the incident, quote, "My grandfather drew no moral for me, but I heard him speaking to my mother that night. It's the sense of ownership that divides people. It's happening in the parish the same way as on the hill. It's an evil that spreads, you'll see. There will soon be no oneness there either." Ownership is a capitalist and therefore American value. Sharing is a communal value. While preschool-aged Mary is inclined to be greedy, her grandfather gently guides her to build community instead. In his old age and increasing dementia, Johnny O'Sullivan is young Mary's closest companion. When he's gone, Mary's sense of Irish community is diminished significantly. Johnny's deathbed scene is not witnessed by readers of the parish and the hill because, as a small child, narrator Mary is shut out of the room where he dies. She's standing alone in the long hall outside of his room in the dark pre-dawn hours as her mother lets in the man Mary only later understands to be the priest. Mary stands in terror as the door closes, separating her from the adults in the room, including her grandfather, for whom she calls out. Finally, she's quieted by a presence she feels near her in the hall. That presence is unnamed, but is presumably her grandfather's departing spirit. When the presence leaves, Mary knows for sure her grandfather is dead. She says of her loss, quote, "I remember the day my grandfather died, for on that day a world died for me, and I was left walled into my own small spirit, and into an isolation I knew would never pass. The only member of my community had gone, and the world was as empty as the day I was born." The isolation Mary feels without her immigrant grandfather is akin to what the immigrant would feel leaving home, or more fitting for this book, what the Irish American would feel leaving his or her concentrated Irish community for the wider American world. Thankfully, Mary discovers that her mother can provide a continuity of the warmth and values she found with her grandfather. Mame, Mary's mother, M-A-M-E, is in this novel the rare second-generation American who has not lost touch with her Irishness. When the presence, that spirit presence, leaves Mary's side, she beats on the death room door, and her living mother is there to comfort her. The encroaching American values, however, threaten the peace and happiness of Mary's family throughout the book. The parish in the hill is a keen, a lament for the Irish American community. There's no going back to the parish once they leave. Perhaps that's why Mary's mother, Mame, she attends all these wakes early on in the book. This is what she does. It's her hobby, almost. She scours the obituaries and goes to all the wakes in Irish parish. Not only is she mourning each individual, but also each piece of the community falling away and the old ways with them. The last scene of the novel, this is why I said this one's the most harsh. Mary Doyle Curran, I would say, was very bitter and angry. And I know people who know her because she actually taught at UMass Boston for decades. So there's still a recently retired professor there who taught with her. So he had a great story about her coming in all these very dramatic purple big hat outfits, and this is not her. But you just get this sense of just anger at what's happening to the Irish American community coming through in this book. So it ends with this dream, Mary's dream. And the final words of the novel, Olagan, 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 which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, but is an Irish word that means lament or wail. Those are the same sounds of keening for the dead that Mary heard earlier at the wake she attends with Mame. And this is what she's hearing in this dream now, at the end. At the time of the wake, Mary says of the sound, because Mame brought her to one, quote, "It was the cry of the living clutching, clasping at the departing spirit of the dead, begging, beseeching his return. It was the cry of those who knew there would be no coming back." In Mary's dream, the departing spirit is of the Irish American community. The connection with the dead has been severed. The dead are raising the keen for the values that have been forgotten by this new generation of Irish Americans who appear in the dream as, quote, red-faced people, prosperous and fat. I love that one. They've achieved the material wealth they so wanted in America, but in the process they've given up their souls. They're consumed by protecting their newfound wealth. They chant, quote, "Don't tread on the tail of me coat, ha-ha." Mary says with each ha-ha, the red-faced people stamped collectively and raised their glasses high in the air. It was a horrible, unmelodious song, and the spirit behind it was vicious and violent. Like Mary's bully brother and social climbing aunts, who I get to talk about in a much longer in my dissertation chapter, these red-faced people have turned their backs on what once made them Irish to protect the money and power they've gained. They're a grotesque embodiment of selling out. They will celebrate the trappings of Irishness acceptable in America, but they lack the values of their parents and grandparents, and they're ready to fight anyone to retain the position they've gained. "Don't tread on the tail of me coat," they say to those coming up behind them. They don't have the power to fight the Yanks, so they turn themselves into them as much as possible, according to Doyle Curran, treading on those below and causing self-hatred at what they've become. None of these characters are very happy. In the dream, Mary says, quote, "As the din increased, the figures of my mother and grandfather rose and with slow, sad step went down the long, dark hallway. No one noticed their departure. I called to them, but they never looked back." That was the same dark hallway where Mary was once comforted by the presence of her grandfather's spirit, and when his spirit departed by the sight of her living mother. But now both of them are leaving too, and saddened by what has become of Irish America. In Mary's dream, the dead keen their lamentation for the living, and this allegory of the fight for the Irish American soul. Of the three novels considered here, Doyle Curran's is the darkest, most damning picture of the changes in mid-20th century, as I've said. Last book, and I promise there'll be time for questions. We're getting to the end. Edwin O'Connor's The Last Hurrah. This is a better one to end on. It's more funny, really. It inserts the warmth and humor into this trend of remembering Irish America, as it was in the late 19th and early 20th century. Perhaps O'Connor's most enduring character, and he has many. Frank Skeffington thought back to his years growing up in a crowded tenement with fondness and admiration for those who lived there. So Frank Skeffington is the only one who's not an immigrant himself out of all these deathbed scenes. He is the son of immigrants. And Skeffington, if you've seen the movie or read the book at some point, you probably know that he was modeled on James Michael Curley, the famous mayor of Boston, many-time mayor of Boston, and one-time governor of Massachusetts. So Frank has some of that same political resume and background, including all of the shady deals and stuff that went with that. But Frank thought back to his years growing up in a crowded tenement with fondness and admiration for those who lived there and bitterness for the landlords who kept them there. Frank remembers the late 19th century of his boyhood. He admires the Irish immigrant women who worked hard to support and educate their families, as well as the men who were the first ward bosses to come out of the neighborhoods and to stand up for people's rights. This is the most political of all the novels, really more of a public kind of book, where the others were family, private matters. But the part of The Last Hurrah that I am most interested in is also this private family passing on of memories to Frank's nephew. So Frank can never forget the treatment of his people, including his own mother, that they received from the Yankee bosses and landlords. His mother was fired for stealing, I think, jam from her employer. She was a domestic, and her kids were hungry at home. The father was deceased, and the boss made sure to publicly humiliate her in front of his family and the rest of the staff before she was fired for stealing. Anyway, this leaves Frank, as you can imagine, with a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He went on to be mayor of a city. Clearly Boston, as I said, though never named, many times over, and even governor of his state for a term. He spent his life trying to uplift the people from his and other poor neighborhoods and seek revenge on the old guard of Yankee bankers and businessmen. And this book is just funny, the way he does some of this. He's also crafty and somewhat illegal, and graft is a big part of his administration, but he's no saint. But Frank is a teller of stories that are aimed at keeping the memories of the Irish ways of his neighborhood alive. And though not an immigrant himself, Frank has always been a keen observer of the generation that came before him, and he's really trying to pass on these stories before he dies. And because his own son proves to be an inept recipient of these stories, Frank seeks out his nephew Adam to bear witness to the last of its kind political campaign, based on talk and loyalty, shady deals, and generosity to constituents, and more talk. Along the way, when Frank is not working a room, he passes on these stories of his people to Adam and Adam's wife, Maeve. Frank tells Maeve of her immigrant grandmother, Ellen O'Donoghue, a penny candy store owner and a voice of wisdom in her community. From Ellen O'Donoghue's story, he leads into other stories, quote, of people of a bygone age, quiet stories, quietly told, warm and affectionate memoirs. So this is what happens between all the political events in the novel. He's telling Adam his stories. Frank needs to tell his stories to Adam so the memory of his people do not go to the grave with him. In essence, the whole novel is what Frank wants to get off his chest before he dies. So it's all kind of a deathbed scene, but there's a great deathbed scene coming up. I'm going to skip because I want to make sure I have time to get to that and to get to your questions. So Frank is conscious of his campaign not only as his last hurrah politically, but also the end of his life and the end of an era for his people. Perhaps the most frightening result of the end of the era is symbolized in the empty-headed middle-class Irish politician being propped up against Frank in this election and ultimately winning the race. Kevin McCluskey is his name, parades his Irishness, complete with a borrowed Irish setter for television, and a newly gifted picture of the Pope for the backdrop of the nightly talks he records for TV. His big family, his clean-cut children, his stay-at-home wife, the cookies and milk, all of it are on these nightly talks on TV. This is O'Connor's illustration of the new Irish-American politician. Sparkling clean and entirely lacking substance. Yet he gets the majority vote because he is the image that people want to see of themselves, it seems. Of all the novels considered here, O'Connor's offers the longest, most detailed deathbed scene, and I'll summarize most of it for you. When Frank is dying, he drifts in his memories through his life, filtering out any disturbing memories and allowing through only tender moments with his mother and wife and triumphant moments in his political career. He's satisfied at the end of his life, having passed on at least some knowledge of the old ways to Adam, having said his goodbyes to his friends and loyal workers, and having made a good confession, of course, to his friend, the Monsignor. At Frank's bedside, there's only one person missing, and one who does not belong. His kind but empty-headed son, Francis, has absented himself from the house during Frank's final hours. That Francis is a junior, and as empty and shallow as the new Mayor McCluskey, does not paint a promising picture for the future of Irish America. They're poor substitutes for the dying man in the bed, even though he's sometimes criminal still. As he has during the final political campaign of Frank's life, however, Adam stands in as surrogate son, so all hope is not lost here. Frank is comforted by the presence of Adam and Maeve, but it's Maeve's father, Roger Shugru, who's a last-minute, unwelcomed addition to the Death Watch. And he gives Frank the opportunity to say arguably the most memorable deathbed line in all of Irish American literature. Shugru has never hid his distaste for the way Frank conducted his business. After Frank's final confession and reception of the sacrament of extreme unction, all is quiet. Thinking Frank dead, Roger smugly pronounces, quote, "Knowing what he knows now, if he had to do it all over again, there's not the slightest doubt but that he'd do it all very, very differently," end quote. Much to the joy of Adam, the Monsignor, and the attending doctor, the dying man rises on his elbows and proclaims, "The hell I would." Though no saint, Frank has no regrets about the way he's served his people and lived his life. After inquiring for his missing son, Frank's departing words to Adam are, "See you around." Frank has said all he needed to say, and Adam has listened. So just a few closing thoughts and then questions. In real life, we don't get these kind of deathbed moments necessarily. I don't know how often they actually happen, but they happen quite often in literature, TV, and movies, where people even in the throes of the last minutes of their lives, have the coherence and the presence of mind, the clarity and consciousness to be able to say exactly what they want to say and the right words to end things with their loved ones. So it's not necessarily realistic. As I said, these aren't histories, right? But through those last words, often the author's values or intentions for these characters are being spoken. And just to sum up, the authors of these novels discussed here today, you can see trends in the things that they do value, the ideas of what made the Irish around the turn of the 20th century. And no group of people is as perfect. And again, it's fiction. But, and I will say that in all of these novels, there are also Irish immigrants even, who are greedy and selfish and arrogant and things like that too. It's not perfect. But these grandparent figures, or in the case of The Last Hurrah, the uncle, they're not perfect, but they do have these values, communal versus individual. They're generous to everyone in need. They fight against oppression. They have, you don't see it as much in The Last Hurrah, but in the other two books, a spiritual, non-judgmental Catholicism. A distaste for arrogance, and this probably, if you're Irish, those who think too highly of themselves are cut right down to size pretty quickly. And then the warmth, kindness, and of course a sense of humor and the ability to tell a good story all are there. One final one, Bren, for real. Thank you. So happy St. Patrick's Day. And it's not exactly the happiest way to celebrate it, but this question is what kind of sparked my research, and celebrations of St. Patrick's Day in the memoir All Souls, as I said, were behind that. So the way we currently celebrate St. Patrick's Day shows this tension in how Irishness is remembered in the U.S. For many, drunkenness is the main goal. I witnessed that the other day at the Worcester Parade and events afterwards. And then others want to celebrate aspects of Irish culture, music, dance, language. St. Patrick, I don't necessarily even see in the parade anymore, but he's a symbol of Irish culture, so there we go. And I'll just leave you with, this whole thing is to wonder what does Irishness mean to us, what does Irish culture mean to us? And this is what I'm looking at through all of this literature, so that's it. We do have some time for questions. I wanted to leave a little more than this, so I apologize, but we have 10 minutes or so, and a handout that I think Margaret maybe has with some reading suggestions if you're interested. Any questions or comments or thoughts, Jim?
Just thinking as you were talking about sort of the theme of Irish literature from the 20th century right through the 21st century, from Joyce to Conan to Tobin, is Irish culture is smothering and something to get away from. And what happened in that transition to American culture where they miss the old sod?
Right. Well, everything looks better when you don't have it, right? The grass is always green. So there's certainly some sentimentalizing of what they had, but I would say even there are aspects of Irish culture that are smothering that you want to get away from, but then there are aspects that are remembered very fondly in those books as well. And the way that people interact with each other, especially the way communities help each other, and the storytelling, the sitting around and having a cup of tea, all of that is remembered very fondly. And that's what these authors are seeing, remembering. They might be choosing to forget, the more smothering aspects of their own childhoods. But they're certainly playing up the values that they're fond of. Distance, right? Big part of it. Other questions? Or?
I think they downplayed St. Patrick a number of years ago because of the fact that, he was supposed to be a good man, and yet, you get drunk on St. Patrick's Day. I mean, it's like, that's a dichotomy. You do one thing and you have the other going, and so I think he turned out to be the excuse to party.
That's a good way to put it.
St. Patrick's Day is very subdued in Ireland, and St. Patrick was Welsh, not Irish.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody claims he's Irish, or maybe they do. I'm sure that some people do, but that
He brought the guilt to Ireland.
I was going to say he brought the Christianity, but that's so the story goes.
Yes, it is, but
Well, he was.
Sorry.
Oh, it's good.
Well, he was the patron saint of Ireland. It doesn't mean that he was Irish.
Right.
But again, my sister was studying in Dublin and happened to be there for St. Patrick's Day. They go to church. They don't party and drink and parade down the streets. It was an eye-opener.
Yeah, I'm told now they're starting to because of the tourist dollars. So.
Well, of course.
And corned beef and cabbage is not the #1 menu.
So I heard.
It's Guinness Irish stew.
Yes, Irish stew. Any other thoughts, questions?
Just on the origins of where St. Patrick came from, he's also reputed to be from France.
Yeah.
So that was the version I grew up with.
Yeah.
And it had a hugely religious impact. I mean, it was a way the whole thing about the shamrock was the way of explaining the three persons in the one God, the Trinity, which is the tenet of the Roman Catholic religion.
Right.
So I just think it's all about symbolism, and St. Patrick sort of was the embodiment of, a certain kind of culture and stuff like that, and that was, people wanted something to believe in,
Yes.
and I think it's like now we start thinking of maybe the shamrock as being Irish rather than St. Patrick, when actually it's the harp is the official symbol of Ireland, and that just seems to have disappeared, even though music is very important in the Irish culture.
Right.
So I guess it's just interesting, but I really enjoyed you talking about like how the conceit of the deathbed was used to like illustrate somebody's life, and it was a way of reckoning the kind of accounting of their lives, and all the good things were remembered. I just think that's interesting, and I just wonder, given the three novels that you picked, and I'm not familiar with any of them, unfortunately, but
That's okay.
I just wondered if the, as we're in Women's History Month as well, would the Miss Curran's sort of negativity have contributed because of her background of being a woman and her gender, growing up in the it was 48, I think she wrote that book.
Yes.
Or something.
Yes.
So at that time where, women were really not really treated well. Or whatever.
True, yeah, although she was highly educated and goes on to be a university professor.
Right.
And the mother character in that, it's a good book for Women's History Month actually too, because it's put out most recently by the feminist press actually, and the mother character is amazing. I didn't get into it here, but when her husband will not join a picket line, she goes and stands in for him, because she says someone from this family is going to represent.
That's great.
So she's just a great character, and a great female character. The bitterness seemed aimed more at the Irish Americans themselves, like, and what they've turned into, as opposed to by gender in that one. She was not, and it was equal. The men and the women get equally slammed.
Perfect.
in her book. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have one.
Sure.
Do you think that this change from communal rural sort of living in Ireland to the modern American of our time, or the last century, do you think that change for the Irish was that much different than for other groups? The Polish, the Russians, the Germans, the whoever. There was a lot of universal experience.
And I don't have the background on the other groups so much, but the Irish seem to just, they do this ethnic American experience first, and again, of people who came over here mostly by choice, not in chains. And I would say my hunch would be that it's replicated then by the other groups that come over. Yeah.
Because a lot of what's in here, I'm a Franco-American background, and I'm second generation in my mother's line, but in my father's line, we were here for 5 generations. So by the time that we came around, they were all Americanized, and they did the same thing. When the French Canadians came down, they did the little candidates here. Well, Providence had them. I don't care, Worcester, any one of the cities. And here in South was the same way. And they were ostracized when they first got here because of language difference, and they stayed in their little communities. But then they helped. One got successful and opened up a store, and they would only go to that store, so that they got to be a little bit more up there. But then, yes, they went up the hill.
Yep.
And then, the rest said, who the hell do they think they are? So, you know, I think every ethnic group that comes to a, you know, to the new world, the United States, you know, they work diligently and get where they can go, and then the others kind of either look at them and say, well, they bought the store, and now, you know, everybody's aiming to do that. And then, you know, we have the same thing with, if you look at the Laotians that are here in town, or the Hispanics that are here in town. You know, in the early 50s, there was one family that was Hispanic. Today, you go around town, and there are how many Hispanic stores in the area, you know, and they have also moved up the hill. They don't live in the same small.
Yeah, and like
So
I
I
said,
think
this stuff, you can hear the
Yes.
arguments against the new immigrants coming in, you just hear it, it just happens over and over.
But, you know, the Irish and the French and Canada were the first large contingents that came in, because, you know, you think that, you know, 1 million something people came. From Canada, they were the same way. They came at a certain time frame, and they were, you know, above and beyond.
Right.
So, you know, yes. they
I guess
brought in-
the German immigration at the time, mid-19th century, was even larger than the Irish, but Germany,
But they went
what I
to the
read, was 9
Midwest.
times the size of Ireland.
Yeah.
But they were, I don't think, as much in these, staying in these ethnic urban neighborhoods.
Did they come from urban ethnic areas though? I mean, were they that concentrated? Ireland, they came from this and they brought it with them. Were the Germans clustered like that?
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. But yeah, I know for the Irish, it was like, it was a very different experience, rural to urban, but then they replicated what they knew anyway. They just made it adapt.
They tried, and, you know, when they realized that there wasn't a lot of green here, if you went to Providence or
Right.
Holyoke, Holyoke was never that large, but yet, you know.
Yeah, it had
attracted them.
according to this novel, it had the mills, the factories, you
Sure.
know, is where they were working in a textile factory.
Yeah.
But I think in all cases, the fraternal groups were really what allowed people within their ethnicities to stick
Yes.
together, and then you had all those various ethnicities in their own groups, but still coming together in a community. I mean, that was definitely the situation here in Southbridge.
Yeah.
You know, in the 1900s, there's just tons of different groups that had, you know, various missions, but they were banded together because of where they came from.
Right.
Matter of fact, 2 churches, well, there was one church in the town at one point, but then the French church and the Irish church were formed on the same exact day, so that group would be above the other.
Yeah. Worcester too, the French church was right across the street from the Irish church. Like,
Yes, at one point,
just,
yes.
you could throw a rock
Sure.
from one church to the
Exactly,
other probably,
exactly.
but they were, and both Catholic,
Yeah.
but separated at the time. So I
But
think
yes.
we're out of time, it seems, unless.
Yes, thank you very much. This was really very interesting. You've indicated that maybe at another point you'd like to come back and maybe talk about more subjects on the Irish American experience. And I think, you know, we're definitely a community that has, you know, a vested interest in the Irish community, so maybe we'll come back. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's hear it again for